And for our final panel of today, our third group will explore design of environments at larger scales, community scales, ecological scales, and we'll be joined by Elijah Martin, a fellow from our first year from Civil and Environmental Engineering, James Bryce, who's from Architecture, and Woods Hole and Environmental Engineering, and Denis Lopez, who's from Urban Studies and Planning. So over to you, Elijah.
So I'll be talking about designing plastics for degradation. So I'm sure, as many of you are aware, plastic waste is a tremendous problem. Pictured here is a bunch of plastic waste in a water body. And we know very little about the environmental lifetime of most of this plastic waste. And if you're still not convinced, the problem is growing, and it is also detrimental to our ecological systems. So plastic mismanagement is predicted to increase as well. And so if we start by thinking about a plastic's life cycle from the design of the material and object through the production, the use phase, and then the various end-of-life options, we have ideally recycling, where it will get put back into production. The next best thing would be disposal in a proper waste stream. And then unfortunately, we end up with a large term of mismanaged waste. And so a solution for this is designing for degradation, where typically we've been feeding the use phase back into the design process, how the material interacts with the user and also its material properties. Recycling has fed back into the design as well recently, but we'd really like to move this mismanagement term to being sort of this rapid feedback into the design process. And in order to do that, instead of waiting for the plastic to move through its whole lifetime, we would like to have this mismanagement be a rapidly iteratable variable that we're able to tune and have it feed back into the design process. Specifically, we think the best way to do this is to do it on timescales that are relevant to industrial plastic production and new material design. So we plan to do this in a high throughput way, and specifically, there are many types of degradation. What I'll be focusing on is elucidating data for photodegradation, just because it's been shown to be an important initiator. So currently, we have these really large format solar simulators, and we'd like to actually scale this down quite a bit, taking inspiration from biology to this 96 well plate format. If we blow this up, we can see that it's orders of magnitude smaller across multiple dimensions. So getting into the design of our device, we starting with our proof of concept, we'll check off some of our design requirements as we go through our final photoreactor module that we then put together in this 72 sample assembly. And so this is the fabricated device, and this is it operating. We run these experiments in water with light. And so this little graphic is just showing kind of basically what's happening in each sample. We have different types of plastics in water. We irradiate it with light, and then we measure the amount of plastic that has broken down. And so we've confirmed degradation for a bunch of different commodity plastics. So this device is really aimed to be used both to gain more information about plastics that already exist, but also to rapidly test new materials as they're made. And so we see also great agreement between our current device that we've designed and previous methods. So the most important thing with this new high throughput device is that we're able to get data that is meaningful and relevant to the environment. And so looking forward, we have demonstrated the high throughput capability. We've showed agreement with previous literature. And then the really interesting thing that I actually didn't talk about much here is that when we're doing it in the small format with UV LEDs, we're able to tease apart some of the mechanistic degradation processes that are happening. And so that is some of the work that we've done going forward. And then if we look back to our sort of new design cycle for materials, I think we're a little step closer to this high throughput photodegradation and material design. So thanks. hand it over to James.
Hello there. My name is James Vincent Bryce. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Architecture and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering with this year's cohort, outgoing. So I work in the area of nature-based coastal adaptation. For anyone who's not familiar, coastal adaptation is basically, the rapid urbanization of our coast, and climate change has driven a lot of kind of hard infrastructure stabilization projects all along coasts all over the world. It's a problem that's not going away. We have sea level rise, we have increased storm severity, erosion. These structures work. I mean, we've been doing this for 100 years now, but there's a lot of negative externalities that are associated with big seawalls and bulkheads and groins. They restrict access to the ocean for coastal communities, both human and non-human. They completely destroy intertidal regimes. They usually have brittle failure modes. And in the case of climate change, when we don't really know how much our sea level is going to rise, the question becomes, how tall do you build the wall? So a potential alternative to this is what is called nature-based coastal adaptation. So this is the idea that we can embed some of the inherent physical resilience that we find in our mangroves, our salt marshes, and our oyster reefs into the design of our built physical infrastructure. Now, I work specifically with oysters. I could talk about them for an hour, but the 30-second version is that oysters are amazing ecosystem engineers that have an extraordinary ability to alter their local environment. They function as critical ecological infrastructure by increasing biodiversity and providing habitat for countless marine organisms, the benefits of which propagate up the trophic web, so then we see stronger fisheries of commercially valuable fish. They also filter an insane amount of water, and so they play an important role in local nitrogen cycles. They also improve water clarity so that more sunlight can get down to the bottom, and your submerged aquatic vegetation that needs sun is happy and produces lots of oxygen, so really important. They also function as social infrastructure by acting as a substrate for increased environmental stewardship within coastal communities. There's evidence dating back 8,000 years that oysters have played a large role in coastal landscapes. We find these shell mounds that are evidence of sophisticated mortuary rites with the oyster. So there's a lot of work now that oyster restoration practitioners are kind of increasingly trying to build green jobs in coastal communities through education and outreach. And of course, the oyster also is, mariculture is a very important industry. But then for me, as a physicist by training, what I get really excited about is the physical infrastructure that oysters can really function as. So by acting as this rough thing in the submerged surf zone, mean flows like currents or waves that propagate over the oyster reef lose energy to turbulence. And so why that's important is the calm waters in the lee of the oyster can reduce erosion on our salt marshes. It can stabilize our shorelines, just like those big bulkheads. It can even reduce wave-driven overtopping and coastal flooding at large scales. And the crazy thing is that these are living things, so they grow with time. And we actually have evidence that the accretion rate of the oyster reef can keep pace with sea level rise. A lot of my interests in general have to do with this idea of what building with nature is. When we're talking about nature-based solutions, what does that even mean? We tend to know now that it's not this. You can't just put plants on a wall and call that building with nature. What is less talked about, though, is what is happening in nature-based coastal adaptation, a kind of similar thing where we've got a lot of engineers who are like, okay, great, oysters do this thing. Let's just plop them on some concrete. But it's actually a lot more complicated because the oysters don't really like that. So my work has to do with starting from the biological consideration. What are the environmental conditions that promote long-term oyster reef success? And how can we use that information to then optimize wave energy loss in that order? So I work in an environmental fluid mechanics lab. And I study mechanisms of wave energy loss in constructed oyster reefs so that we can kind of optimize this design solution. And finally, I mean, we're nature, right? We're a part of the environment. So for me, building with nature is also engaging with coastal communities, doing outreach and education. There's a group in New York, the Billion Oyster Project, that likes to say restoration without education is temporary. So I definitely take that to heart. Ultimately, building with nature is sort of the sum total of reconciling the physical, ecological, and social processes in these landscapes. So this is the work that I do. Thank you.
Hi. Can I take this out of here? Hello. My name is Denis, and I'm gonna get out of the podium because it makes me nervous. I'm from Mexico, and my story really starts in 2017. There was a massive earthquake in Oaxaca, which is here in the south, which is mainly indigenous communities. It was like the strongest earthquake of the century or something like that, they called it. But 2 weeks later, there was an earthquake in Mexico City, and all of the attention shifted to Mexico City. That was a huge problem for the communities here. For example, this is all of the plan that existed for rubble management, all of it, 3 pages for Oaxaca. And essentially it said, do what Mexico City did, create a park with all the rubble that you missed. I don't know, it was like nonsensical, to be fair. And what actually happened on the ground with rubble was this. Massive misuse of resources, no one knew what to do, an ecological crisis of its own. So when you go to Oaxaca and you ask people, hey, what happened with the disaster? They actually answer, what disaster? The earthquake or what the government did after? So this is where I was like, okay, I'm an architect, I'm an urban designer, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher. I can do something. We can do something about this. We cannot just be here and stay stable. So we created a participatory action research organization called Bichechedilla, which in Zapotec means, well, in Spanish, it's Zapotec in Spanish, it means spread the word. And it's what we wanted to do, connect people on the ground to people here, to policymakers, to start and do something for real. So we partnered with students there in Oaxaca, and then expanded the team. 2 people across MIT and Harvard and Oaxaca and UNAM. So this ended up being like a huge collective of people that's still working today on not only understanding what happens during a disaster, but also doing things while we understand to not just stay on paper. So as a designer, for me, this meant a specific method. What can I do? I can do archival research for sure. I'm good at photography. It's gonna work out for some reason. We can do some mapping too. Go around, understand what's happening. Let's do workshops with women and children. Tell them, let us understand what the use of public space is, how has it changed after the earthquake, what can we do for you? Let's do a survey, which we partnered with people from public health across the 5 towns that we were working in. Let's do interviews with people here, people there, people everywhere. It's like, we're gonna understand this, but also, we're gonna do stuff about it. So what did we do? First, there's a website. All of the information we collected is public because people on the ground asked us for it. There are many outcomes. We did an exhibition. This is my wife on the back of a truck because we went to each of the towns that we worked on after we worked on them to say, here are our results. This is what we learned. How is it useful for you? How is it useful for us? How do we share this information? We also designed projects as architects, of course, with the reusing the rubble from the earthquake to create community centers. This is a project from one of our partners, which treat water, et cetera, et cetera. I wrote my thesis about this back in my master's. And on my thesis, I asked people, like, who's responsible to manage things after a disaster? And they were like, the government. And I was like, yeah, of course. Do you trust the government? Everything on your read is who people don't trust. And it's government, like municipal government, state government, federal government. Who do you trust? On the left is a church, but the second one is universities. And I was like, okay, if you're gonna trust universities and we can do something about it, I'm gonna keep going. And that's what brought me here to MIT. And one of the things that I'll tell you very quickly about that I'm working on right now is after the earthquake, of course, COVID started when I started the PhD. And I started to understand the patterns of mortality and what is going to happen in indigenous communities. And I was also taking a photography class. So again, I was like, designer cap. I met Doña Laura. And Doña Laura, as a project for my photography class, I interviewed her, understood her story. Turns out she lost her house to the earthquake that I told you about. And while rebuilding it, her husband was rebuilding it, her husband died of COVID. And I was like, disasters are not a one-time thing, they accumulate. And they accumulate, and that means something, and we can do something about it. So, Doña Laura, I asked her, can I please do my project with you? And she was like, of course. And can we fundraise? Of course. So this is her husband actually here, her story, her family. Get the team together again. This is most of the team. Many of them worked on the first project too. Let's do something about it. Let's build this storefront. Finish your project. And while we finish your project, I'll understand what happened in policy and what failed and what not. But let's build this thing. So we are building it right now. It's one of the things I'm working on. And there's going to be a memorial wall for her husband. That's who I am, and that's what I work on. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the discussion.
Cool. Really great to hear everyone's work from before also, but especially you guys working at the scale of the environment. When we were talking, something like a reoccurring theme that came up was scale. Because when you're working in design in the environment, there's not just like an enormous span of spatial scales that we're dealing with, but there's also these temporal scales, whether you're talking about the scale that controls chemical, degradation or the scale of disasters. So I would definitely be curious to hear how spatial and temporal scales influence design in your work.
Yeah, I can go first, I guess. I think like the larger scales of both time and then also space are really what motivate the work. And then, of course, in the lab, we have to abstract everything. So we try to bring that into scales relevant to a PhD or to lab work or something like that. So it's also important to like be able to compete at shorter time scales to then change the way materials are designed. But I think if you really lose the North Star of what are the long-term impacts, that's kind of how we end up in the place we've ended up.
To me, time and scale are everything in a disaster, because if I cannot connect them, I cannot work. So during a disaster, I need to understand the mistakes that have happened, the ones that can come, the ones that are like evolving in the present response, and also who's involved. It's like, is it the government? Is it the people? Is it academia? So like it's connect. As a designer, that's my job, to connect and to be able to connect in a way that results in something, if that makes any sense.
Right. There's like a telescoping that I feel like I see happen in all of our work. I think for me, especially thinking about nature and how we define nature, that's always kind of challenging because, I mean, there are the little microphytobenthos that we can't see living in the tidal flats. But there are also kind of like collaborators in any design in the environment. And I think as well, and you can probably relate to, the environment is not just, we learned this in like 5th grade. It's not just the biotic factors. It's like the abiotic factors, right? It's the forces. And those are the forces of people and government or the force of the sun or the force of the waves. And so I think for me, like finding the way to focus on the scales that are relevant for a specific problem, but then also always doing that telescoping out is super important.
Yeah, I'm curious, I guess, while we're on the topic of scale, is how you both think about the impact at both the small scale of your work and then also the long term, and how you communicate both of those potentially cohesive, but potentially maybe sometimes at odds.
Sure. Yeah, that's tricky because especially with climate adaptation, the time horizons for some things are like 50, 100 years. So when you're talking to people about climate change and you're saying, I promise this is going to be important soon, it's like hard to have that conversation with people. But at the same time, so much of what is driving our need to work in coastal adaptation is what we're seeing right now. It's flooding during high tide. So I think I try to always give people like a near term win or something to focus on. Like, what does building with nature and the environment do for communities now? And a lot of that is improving our relationship to the land and increasing stewardship. And, some of the near term effects like erosion, we can see sediment dynamics pretty quickly, while also having that conversation about, I promise in 50 years, this, oyster reef can be something magnificent. But the work kind of has to start now.
I guess I understand where you're coming from. Like in a disaster, it's easier, quote unquote, because everything that can go wrong is going wrong and you're seeing it happen. So it's like, see how this is happening? This is going to happen again. And people believe you. It's like, okay, of course, an earthquake is going to happen again, etc. So, and all of the things that are going wrong can go wrong again. During the disaster and during the immediate recovery, it's easy to convince people and to communicate that it's important. After, like, give it 6 months or a year when you want to keep working on it, and like these things accumulate, it becomes impossible. It's like well, not impossible, but it's like, I promise that this is gonna be important. Pay attention. So I guess, I don't know, the easiest way to communicate for me is to use a crisis at its most and keep bringing it back and keep reminding people, like, we need to keep this in mind. But it's never, I don't know, it's not black and white. So.
Yeah, I think we'll send it to.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you all for your presentations. They were so insightful. This is a question for James. I really, really enjoy nature-based design.
Thank you.
I learned a while ago that the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is. And so I'm just wondering what your decision-making process was working with oysters and whether you're looking to expand to co-designing with other organisms in the future.
Yeah, I think part of the difficulty of making nature-based solutions happen is a lot of the way we design is very predictive. So we want these models that have all the answers and can predict this is exactly how the wave is going to transform. And I mean, a lot of my work has to do with improving our predictive models. But at the same time, when you're working with nature and the uncertainty that comes with that, with climate change, but also just collaborating with an organism that you can't directly communicate with, is switching to an approach that is like adaptive and predictive. And so I like that you brought up that point about resilience, because I think that's why the environment is so resilient, because it can adapt. It's not that it's just like powerful in its own right. And so for me, working with the oyster has a lot to do with not just the capacity of an oyster reef to attenuate wave energy, but the fact that they grow with time, and that's a process that we can kind of facilitate thinking about things like larval settlement and nutrients in the coastal landscape. Yes, I would love to collaborate with more organisms in the environment, always.
One more.
There's no mic. If there are no other questions, I guess that means you three have solved everything. But please join me in thanking this panel.